Monique, Elevate, elevate with Monique, Elevate with Monique.
Hey, hey, hey. Welcome back to another episode of Moments with Mo. So, in this episode, we are talking about something that I don't think that people love talking about all the time, and that is vulnerability. And so, the topic for today is in order to be transformed, you must be willing to be vulnerable. Now, I know that vulnerability is one of those things that sometimes people equate to being soft or being sensitive, or I don't know what other word I could use, but vulnerability is usually not looked at as a strong quality or a strong characteristic to have because it gets a bad rap. But you have to be willing to be vulnerable at some points of your journey if you are looking for transformation. So, with that being said, let's jump right into it. Now, the power of being vulnerable. Why is vulnerability so powerful? Well, for one, it helps us to make connections, right? It's very difficult to make connections with people who are very stoic and very, hard, and they don't really let you into their world or into their space. It's very hard to do that because it's like you have this desire to connect with them, but what you're getting from them is hard to penetrate, right? It's hard for you to get through because they're closed. They're not open to that connection. So vulnerability, the power of vulnerability really helps us to build connections and real connections, right? Authentic connections, because when you're vulnerable with people and you're naturally building that connection, you're sharing yourself with them, you're sharing your life with them. You might even be sharing, some of your challenges or your concerns or your fears with them. And so that naturally makes them gravitate closer to you. So that's the first thing. It helps us to make connections, but then it just also adds that element of humanness. When someone is vulnerable, let's say they are giving a speech or they are telling a story, and there's a difference between someone who is giving this speech and giving all this great information versus someone who's using real life experiences to make that connection and show their humanness in that particular scenario. Case in point, I'm going to share a story. I'm going to be vulnerable for a moment. So, today I realized through just a series of activities that have happened on one of the project teams that I am on, I realized today that there is something that I am still dealing with as it relates to being triggered with certain interactions with people, right? And so I was in this meeting, and the meeting was happening, and there were some things that were happening within the meeting that really irritated me. And I knew that there was something that was triggering me because when I jumped off that call, I started to feel tears well up in my eyes. And I mean, I will cry. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I'm opposed to crying, but typically it takes a lot for me to get to a place where I'm crying. That means that I've either dealt with it for a while, or I'm really really frustrated about a thing, and that is the way that I release it. Or I've been carrying things for a while, and now it's just time for a good release, and typically that's a cry. But to me, for today, it was really that thing really annoyed me and it hurt my feelings, is really what it is. Let's just call it what it was. It hurt my feelings, okay? And so I had to be open enough to be vulnerable, to go down a particular conversation pathway with myself before I even addressed it to the person that I needed to address it to. And the conversation was very simple, but it was very powerful for me because in that moment where I'm crying, I'm saying, okay, Monique, what is wrong? Well, I feel unheard. Okay, well, why do you feel unheard? Well, because this person did this, this, and this. Okay, well, why does what they did make you feel unheard and now that bothers you? Well, because it's attached to what I realized, it's attached to that validation piece that I have been healing, right? And so then it was like, well, what is it about the validation piece? What hurts you in that? Well, I was compared when I was a teenager and a young adult, I was compared most of my life to other people. And it never made me feel like I was good enough um, because I was always compared to other people. So you see what I'm saying? The conversation just kind of went down this rabbit hole, a productive rabbit hole, in order for me to get to the root of what it was. But if I was not vulnerable enough to even acknowledge that this activity makes me feel a way, then I would have never even been able to have that type of conversation and then have the conversation from a emotionally intelligent standpoint with the people that I needed to have it with. So that is why vulnerability is so, so, so important, because when I reached out to the person that I needed to reach out to, I told them how this made me feel. I was actually crying on the phone with that person. And that was another level of vulnerability because I've never cried in front of that person before. I've never had that type of emotional response to something that was happening at work, right? But it shows that I have feelings, that I'm human, and that I'm open to bridging a gap over this particular situation. It would have never happened if I was not willing to be vulnerable. Okay? So the power of being vulnerable is that it helps us to make connections. It helps us to bring in that element of being human. And then it also invokes empathy. Um, for all of my empaths out there, we all know that natural empaths, we just pick up other people's energy until we learn how to manage that just naturally, right? But for others who are maybe not as sensitive in that way, having the ability to be vulnerable really just you put yourself out there, and not that you're looking for sympathy from anyone, or not that we are looking for sympathy from anyone, but it is very, very, very natural for people to respond with empathy when you are vulnerable enough to express how you feel, express what it is that you need to say, and give them space in order to absorb that and respond, right? You get that level of empathy that comes with being vulnerable. Most of the time, when someone is vulnerable and they're being vulnerable in front of a person or people, typically people usually respond with like a, oh my gosh, or thank you so much for sharing that, or I never knew that you felt that way. And that's just a level of empathy that just comes along with that vulnerability, okay? So now let's talk a little bit about the need for vulnerability. We talked about the power of vulnerability, helps you make connections, it invokes empathy, and you get that element of humanness. But then the need for vulnerability is that it really does help to build trust in relationships. Think about your best friend or a very close friend that you have, right? As you all were building that relationship, if it's a true, genuine relationship, there were times where you both had to be vulnerable with each other because you shared parts of yourself, you shared parts of your life, you shared parts of experiences with one another that started to build this bond, this deeper bond that you carry with someone that's a good friend versus someone who's an acquaintance, right? With an acquaintance, you may not be as vulnerable because you haven't built that level of trust, and so you don't divulge, your life in that way. But someone who you value, someone who you have a desire to have some sort of connection with, it's going to build trust in that relationship. I remember when I was much younger, I was probably in my 20s, and I remember having like these new friendships, and in my mind I would be like, I ain't telling them my business until they tell me theirs. And while that is so immature in the way that I thought about it, what it really boils down to is me saying, I'm not going to put myself on the line to be vulnerable and put myself out there if the person that I'm also building this relationship with isn't going to do the same. I wanted to know that I could trust them. And again, it's the wrong way to think about approaching it, but the concept is still the same, right? I'm still not going to go out here and just give my whole life, although I'm not ashamed of my life. I'm just not going to just give certain parts of myself to just any and everybody. It's got to be a place where I feel safe, and it's got to be a place where I have that trust, that level of trust, in order for me to bring a certain level of vulnerability. Okay. Another need for vulnerability is that it really does increase humility. When you think about someone who's very prideful, typically they're very secretive, they're very arrogant, they're very like, you can't tell them anything, they know it all, they've got all the answers, right? It's very hard for them to be vulnerable. It's very hard for them to say, I don't know, or I need help, or I'm struggling with this, or this hurt my feelings. It's very difficult for those type of people to do that. And so when you're thinking about vulnerability and um, how important it is in situations, it really allows you to start operating from a place of humility without like this downtrodden, whoa, it's me. It's like I'm showing up my authentic, absolute best version of myself. And in that, this is what I struggle with. These are the things that I still am challenged with, or this is what I've done in my life, or what have you. And because of that, and I see where I am today, I know where God has brought me. I can't help but to be humble by that, right? I can't help but to be humble by all of these experiences that I'm sharing with you, or that I'm that I'm allowing to be on display. But in spite of that, I still know that God has always kept his hands on me. He's always protected me, and because of that, I am humbled by it. You won't get that same response, or you won't get that same reaction from someone who's prideful, because most of the time people who are very prideful, they think that they're self-made, they think that no one helped them, they think that like they just have all of everything put together on their own, and that's not true. We all need each other. We all have this interconnectedness that is important for humanity. And so being able to have that sense of vulnerability, it keeps us humble. It keeps us in this space of gratitude. I've got 3 ways where you can add more vulnerability into your life right now. The first one is open communication. A few minutes ago, I talked about how when you have this level of vulnerability, the power of vulnerability is making connections, right? So, open communication allows for us to express our vulnerability. The same scenario that happened today, once I moved past what I needed to process, And once I moved past what it was that I needed to identify, I was then able to have a conversation with the person that I needed to have a conversation with. And not only was it filled with empathy, but it was a way for it to be open dialogue and them to also share what their intentions were versus what I may have perceived it to be. Okay. And here's the thing, this is what I am learning about myself, and I hope that you are learning as well. We are all humans. We are all going to make mistakes. We are all going to always have something that we can learn and grow from. But we cannot expect for other people to always appreciate or agree with things that may ruffle us or things that may make us feel a certain way. That is why we have to be open, to be vulnerable, so that we can bring in open communication. There is absolutely nothing better than a relationship with ourselves, a relationship with other people, a relationship with our Father, our Creator, when it can be open communication. Actually, mm, communication is one of the main reasons why relationships break down, because people don't effectively communicate, or they don't communicate with vulnerability. Hey, this bothered me. Hey, I didn't like it when you, or hey, am I reading this right? Because what I got was XYZ, right? Being open to have that conversation, to then say, okay, let me take a step back and let's work this thing out. Let's see how we can come to a resolution. Not that I'm always trying to get you on my side or you always trying to get me on your side, but the dialogue is open. The conversation is open. So that is one way that you can bring in more vulnerability. Just open the conversation up more. Be more communicative. Be more willing to express how you're feeling, or if something makes you feel a way, be okay with expressing that and telling the people that you need to tell those things, okay? Another way that you can be more vulnerable and add more vulnerability is really just through self-reflection. Um, Last week in our private our private Elect Elevation Facebook group, we started talking about, finishing this year out strong and focusing on next year. But what we focused on last week was reflection. And not only was it just like the reflection of the year, but it was also internal, like self reflection internally. And self reflection will definitely invoke a level of vulnerability, because when you sit with yourself, I just told you the whole dialogue that I had with myself. If I was not aware, self aware enough, if I had not done the work to accept myself enough, I would have been in denial about that. Tears and all. Tears and all, I would have been in denial that I was even bothered by it, right? But because I am much more vulnerable in my life than I've been in past years, I'm able to sit with myself and I'm able to reflect on separating the two. Is this a Monique thing? Is this a something that Monique needs to explore and understand more about? And the answer was yes, because there was a trigger in there, right? So now getting to the root of that trigger is my responsibility. But then also it was also equally powerful to be able to not just self-reflect, but then ask the questions that needed to be asked so that I can resolve the real issue, the real challenge, or heal the real wound, right? But if I wasn't self-reflecting, if I was not willing to go deep inside of me, instead of pointing the finger and saying, well, they should have, they could have, they didn't, going inside and saying, okay, let's talk, then I wouldn't have come to that conclusion. Granted, I still had the conversation, but I had it from a different place. I didn't have it from a place of being the victim. I had it from a place of, these are the facts, this is what it was, this is what it made me feel like, and let's talk about it, okay? And I wasn't I ain't gonna lie, I wasn't just openly willing to talk about it right then. I didn't want to talk about it right then. I wanted to kind of talk about it a little bit later, but it happened that we talked about it right then, and it was the best resolution versus waiting a little bit longer. And then another way, the third way that you can bring more vulnerability into your space, into your life right now, is seeking guidance and feedback. And I'm going to say seeking guidance and feedback from the right people, from the people who you value, from the people who you know are going to keep it a buck, from the people who are going to give you honest um, feedback. Because everybody's feedback doesn't deserve a place in your mind, in your heart, and in your life. We know that. So what I'm talking about when I say seeking guidance and feedback, I'm talking about from the people that matter. But think about it. When you go to someone, and I've done this multiple times with different experiences in my life. But when you go to someone and you say, hey, I have a question. Can you give me feedback on your experience with me? Can you give me some guidance on how to navigate this journey of unforgiveness? I truly feel like, to be honest with you, in order for you as a woman or any woman, any client that I work with, there has to be a level of vulnerability, right? Because you've got to be vulnerable enough and self-aware enough to say, you know what, I could use some help in that area. I could use some support. And I have always tipped my hat off to my clients that I've worked with who have taken the courage to say, you know what, I need guidance in this. I need some guidance in this. That took a level of vulnerability from them. So think about that when you are looking to become a better version of yourself, looking to heal certain areas of your life, looking to elevate your entire life. Getting feedback and getting that guidance, it shows a level of vulnerability, which is very, very powerful, because it tells the people around you that you value their opinion enough to solicit it and see how you can apply it to your own life. That's major. That's huge. If you are new to my channel, I want to say welcome, and I encourage you to peruse some of the other videos, leave comments. I love people who engage. And then if you are returning, I want to say welcome back to Moments with Mo. I am your hostess. I am Mo, aka Monique McCoy. Hey, I am so happy to connect with you, and I look forward to elevating with you. Thanks for stopping by.